about the origins of the natives of the Americas. Now we're going to be talking about exploration. Our focus is going to be shifting to Europe, okay? So remember that 1500 range, Europe had just gone through a major plague that basically decimated their population, their food supply, and made people more cynical about their monarchs because they felt betrayed by the monarchs who had been able to withstand the plague better than they themselves had been able to. We see after this Black Plague also that the population bounced back, okay? It came back. And with that, we had an increase for demand for food and for goods. People needed food to eat. They needed goods around their house, goods, cloth, lumber, swordsmithing, what have you. So, along with this, we had the monarchs, okay? Monarchs decided that whoever had the most land in the New World was the most powerful. And you'll see this competition going between the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the English, all competing for that land, competing for that power. So the English, as we'll talk about, gained a sizable amount of territory throughout the entire world, all the way from North America to South America, all the way from Europe, all the way into Asia and Australia. So the saying was that the sun never set on the English Empire because the English had territory throughout the entire world. So the sun, it was daytime, always somewhere in part of their land. So the Portuguese, Prince Henry of the Portuguese, he took to colonization and exploration as a means for expanding trade routes and areas for his country. Remember how we talked about trade routes meant power. You have the trade routes, you have the power. So he wanted to use the New World as a means for expanding those trade routes, finding goods, and that sort of thing. We had Bartholomew Diaz, who went around the tip of Africa in 1486. He wanted to find a direct sea route to Asia. But the victor of this goal was actually Vasco da Gama. He was the first to go around the tip of Africa and all the way to India. So this was a major feat for that time period. The Spanish were the first to actually travel to the Americas. And you might recall the name Christopher Columbus. He traveled to the Americas in 1492 under Queen Isabella of Spain. His fleet was made up of the Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria. He did not actually hit the mainland of South America and Mesoamerica until around 1498. So at first, he actually landed in the Caribbean, the Bahamas, and Cuba. He created a colony of Hispaniola, and he named the Americas for Italian Amerigo Vespucci. We have the 3 G's, God, Gold, and Glory. These were the goals of the conquistadores of the Spanish. Hernando Cortez, he came to the Americas and befriended the Tlaxcalans. They were military allies. He used them in a lot of his battles to be able to conquer many Native American tribes. So, of these, he conquered the Aztecs and he conquered the Tenochtitlan with the help of the Tlaxcalans. We had a major incident with smallpox. This was a huge disease that went throughout the New World. You have to remember that these people had been separated from the other half of the world for generations. So unlike the other half of the world that had been, such as Europe and Africa and Asia, that had been exposed to things like smallpox, to the plague, to the common flu, these guys over in the New World, in the Americas, had not been exposed to that. So they had not built up the immunities through the generations to be able to deal with that sort of illness. So many of them were killed because of smallpox. Hernan de Cortez worked with the Tlaxcalans to destroy the Aztecs. He blocked off trade routes and water and food routes. Okay, so basically any way they could get supplies for wartime, any way they could get water or food for their families, he completely blocked it off. He cut off all canals, and he cut off the aqueducts. So he's not only cutting off the trade routes, but he's also cutting off water sources for them. He destroyed their temples and their homes. That should tell you what the Spanish thought of the Native American religion right here. They're destroying the temples. Those are their holy places. But the Spanish disregarded them. They said they are not Catholic, they are heretics. Therefore, this must go. Cortez followed Francisco Pizarro, who conquered Peru. Okay? So going down the list, we got the Catholic missions. So remember, these were missions set up with the goal of converting the natives. You can think of one over in Texas. Remember, we have the Alamo. That is still standing from whenever the Spanish came in to work on converting the natives over to Catholicism. And it was from up here, because remember, Texas used to be a part of Mexico, all the way down through South America. So the thought was you either had to convert or you faced severe retribution. Remember, this is the same time as the Spanish Inquisition. This is the same time where if you were accused of being a heretic, you could be burned at the stake or hung just because of somebody's assumptions that you were not following the Christian way. We have St. Augustine in Florida. This is where they chose to have a permanent settlement. It became a military outpost for the Spanish. This is very strategic because if you look over here, nope, not that. If you look over here where Florida is, it's right in between this area here, right between this area here and down through South America. It was near a lot of different posts that the Spanish ended up establishing. So this became a major military route for them. We had Onate, which is in Mexico, to New Mexico. There were many battles with the Pueblo natives, okay, with Onate. There was battle over the tribe's refusal to share their food. The Spanish and a lot of other European nations, because they looked down upon Native Americans, any act of refusal, any act of theft was met with severe retribution. So because they refused to share their food, the Spanish ended up killing 800 members of the tribe with the Pueblo Indians. They also enslaved anyone 12 or older, and anyone who was military age and male had their foot cut off. They're taking out any way for the Pueblo natives to be able to fight back because their military men had their foot cut off. They cannot fight effectively when they don't have both their feet. They also established encomiendas. This is the right to demand tribute, taxes, and forced work from the natives. We had Pope. Okay, so the Spanish were trying to force natives to convert. Some of them rejected the religion of Catholicism altogether. Others tried to appease the Spanish. They would mix their own religion with those of the Catholic faith. So they could say, hey, I am practicing your faith. I'm just also keeping my beliefs too. So because of this, because the middle ground was such a gray line, they had a hard time agreeing over what established true conversion. And there were many, many, many fights and arguments and wars fought over this subject. 1680, Pope, he's the Native American religious leader, finally had enough. There were a population of around 26,000 Pueblo Indians. And the Spanish priests and government were actually working together to try to suppress any other ways of thinking. So any of these people who had mixed their own practices. Any of these people who had rejected the practices, they were the ones who these priests and government officials would have been targeting. So they captured Santa Fe under Pope, the Native American religious leader, captured Santa Fe, and they actually drove out the Spanish for a while. It was only short-lived, however. If you know, as it happened in 1680, around 1696, the Spanish came back, and they took New Mexico. But they did have some concessions. They stopped enslaving the natives. They let the natives mix Catholicism with their own religion, and they allowed Pueblo Native Americans to own their own land. They also had intermarriage between the Spanish and the natives. Remember, we have a lot of Spanish males in this time period, but not a lot of Spanish women who came over to the New World. A lot of those women were still under their families, and their families would not allow them to leave unless they were married. So, the solution for a lot of these Spanish males who did not find marriage partners, they turned to the Native American woman. And they had offspring known as mestizo. Their offspring was known as mestizo. They were of mixed Spanish and Native American lineage. In 1750, the Spanish population was around 4,000 in this area. New Mexico we're talking about. And the Pueblo Native American population was around 13,000. So you can see this huge difference where most of these are males. Most of these are probably more mixed, 51% male, 49% female, or somewhere around there. So it was very advantageous to the Spanish men to try and find marriage partners upon the Native American population. A lot of the Native Americans, however, did end up dying due to disease, due to war between the tribes and between the European nations, and due to migration. They would leave. So, biological exchange. Remember that Columbian exchange, that exchange of goods between Europe, the Americas, and Africa? This is when that was really established, okay? Remember, it's the exchange of goods between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Diseases like smallpox, flu, measles, and typhus flew through the Americas. Remember that immunity had not been yet built to those diseases, so millions died. So why did it spread so much? Native Americans tended to care for the sick differently, than the Europeans did. Native Americans would actually sit by the person's side and tend to them constantly. Remember that these diseases like smallpox, the flu, they are extremely contagious. So sitting next to the side of someone constantly who has it is most likely going to make you sick. But they believe that this would foster healing. Okay? And remember, they also had no natural immunity to the diseases. Their family had not been exposed to it throughout the generations, so their body did not have that mechanism of knowing what antibodies to use to fight the virus. Okay? It's similar to our reaction to COVID-19. This is a newer virus that we're facing right now. And it's much worse than the flu because our bodies aren't as used to fighting this family of viruses right here. So, as opposed to the Native Americans, Europeans would completely isolate the sick individuals. They would go to a very extreme lengths to do this. They would lock families in their houses, nail the doors shut. They would burn the houses down. They did not want to get the bubonic plague. So in Hispaniola, remember this was established by Columbus, the native population, they give you an idea of how bad this occurrence of disease in a Native American population was. The native population in Hispaniola actually decreased from 1 million people to 500. So it was a huge hit on the Native American tribes. Some were able to rebuild. We lost many cultures cultures, traditions, and languages that we're never going to get back because the entire tribe was wiped out. However, when these tribes were sick and dealing with this disease, the Europeans took this as a sign from God that they should overtake the tribes because he was making them weak. They should go in and take the land. So cultural exchange, what happened between here? So Europeans gave to natives sugar, bananas, cattle, pigs, sheep, and horses. So whenever you see things like horses with Native Americans, remember that that did not happen until after the Europeans came over to the Americas. They also brought over grass seed, which ended up overtaking the natural vegetation in a lot of our country because there was no competition for that plant to grow. It was not natural here. Natives gave to Europeans maize and corn, squash, pumpkins, beans, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, and potatoes. So remember things like tomatoes that the Italians used for things like pizza or pasta, that was not possible until after they came to the New World. Same thing with potatoes. When the Irish used the potatoes for a main food source, that was not possible until after they came to the New World. Also, the natives introduced syphilis into the European population as a disease that they had not been exposed to before. So, natives dealt with the European culture shock in a number of ways. One of these was that they would mix up the Portuguese and the Spanish with their own native tongue and actually created their own languages from a blend of the three. And it made it easier also because other tribes did this. And remember, those other tribes did not speak the same language. It made them easier to communicate with one another because they had adopted similar languages. Remember that we had that number of European men greatly outnumbering the number of European women. So they had a forced marriage between a woman of the Native American tribes and the Spanish men. Europeans tried to implement the practice of indentured servitude. What is that? Basically, it is having an individual work a certain amount of time, doing a certain amount of work, and then once that certain individual is done, then they would get money and land and be able to start their own lives. Native Americans were resistant to this practice, and those who did agree to it, a lot of them ended up being killed by many diseases like smallpox. So, because of this, because the Europeans could not enslave the Native Americans like they wanted to, they decided to look into the market of Africa instead. They looked at Africans as being advantageous because they already had an immunity to things like smallpox because they had been exposed to it for generations. Therefore, it would not hit them as hard. And the slave trade network already existed way before they had explored over into the Americas. It was a practice that was established in West and Central Africa, also known as the Gold Coast. So they had very sophisticated economies and political systems. These areas were very advanced compared to other areas along Africa. They traded ivory, gold, and slaves, and the region was Islamic. Remember that this region of Africa was a main convert of Islam. So this would eventually result in conflict between Europeans and their slaves because the slaves tended to be Islamic. So, a part of the Gold Coast. Ghana was a part of the Gold Coast until around 1100 AD. This then turned into Mali. We had Timbuktu as part of the Gold Coast. Yes, Timbuktu does actually exist. It's a region famous for trading, education, and cultural exchange. Again, it's similar to the Cahokia of North America, similar to New York, similar to Tenochtitlan. It's a major city center. Over in West Central Africa, we have the Kingdom of the Congo. So this was a center of trade. They traded pottery, copper, and iron goods. So by early 1500, most of the upper class had actually converted to Catholicism. This would have made this area a lot more powerful, because not only do they have the center for trade, showing that they are more of an advanced civilization, they are also uh, they're also able to communicate with the Vatican and have the Vatican's support. This is a huge thing. If you had the Vatican support, you had money for your country, and you had a military to protect your country. It was a huge thing. So they had an emissary who would actually travel between the Congo and the Vatican to act as an ambassador.